Awesome. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's homecoming event. What to expect when you're expecting an election, a special alumni webinar series. As always, we hope everyone with us this evening is doing well, and we thank you for taking your time out of your evening to join us. I want to take a moment to let everyone know some tips for your best webinar experience. We have muted all participants and would like to remind everyone to keep themselves on mute throughout the presentation so that we're able to hear our presenters. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the evening, so please submit any questions you may have via the chat. You can submit questions anytime throughout the evening, and they will get to them during the Q&A session. At this time, I am really excited to introduce this evening's professors, two of FDU's favorite professors. Dan Casino is an associate professor of government and law at Fairleigh Dickinson University and director of experimental research for the Public Mind Poll. After finishing his doctorate in political economics at Stony Brook University, he did research at Princeton before coming to FDU in 2006. His work on how men's gender identities impact their socio-political attitudes and behaviors has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and in other national media outlets. He is the author or co-author of several books, including his most recent Fox News and American Politics, and a top-selling textbook on social science research methodology, soon to be in its second edition. In addition to academic journal pieces, he has written about politics, polling, and gender for Newsweek and the Harvard Business Review. He's also a frequent commentator on radio and television outlets in New York, national and international media markets. We're also happy to have with us tonight Dr. Peter Wooley. Dr. Wooley is the founding director of the School of Public and Global Affairs and is professor of comparative politics. He was the Florham campus provost from 2012 to 2017 and co-founder and for many years, the executive director of the Public Mind. As such, his research in public opinion and his political commentary have been cited in news outlets from Sydney Morning Herald to the Washington Post and Trenton Times, from NJN to CNN, and in newspapers from Alaska's Ketchikan Daily News to the Miami Herald. Dr. Wooley was awarded a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh in 1987. He studied at the Sorbonne and at the University of Bordeaux, and later in Japan as a member of a Fulbright Hays Group project. He was an advanced research scholar at the U.S. Naval War College and won the Edward Millard History Prize from the U.S. Naval War College in 1997. I am very happy to hand it over to Dr. Peter Wooley and Professor Dan Casino.
We're delighted to be here. That's for sure.
Exactly. It's always fun.
It is fun. So thanks for that, Jen.
Yeah,
thanks for inviting us.
And one of the big problems that we've had with being online, aside from the problems we have teaching students, it's harder to engage the students sometimes, is we don't get to see our friends on campus. And of course, Peter and I go way back. We've been running polls together since 2006. So we've been doing this together for a long time. And I have never gone 6 months without sitting down and having lunch with Peter Wooley. So I'm very happy to be here to be talking with Peter tonight.
Yeah, that's right. I hadn't thought of that, Dan. It's been a long time since we had lunch.
So what we normally would be doing if we were having lunch is we would be talking about politics, because apparently we are gluttons for punishment and we just want to talk about this stuff and get this in. And unfortunately, since you are all here, you're going to have to listen to us talk about politics. But I think that's kind of what we're here for anyway, right, Peter? So,
well, I would hope so. That's all right. Our holidays are busman's holidays. We talk about politics. And I want to let the audience know, too, my favorite political scientist is actually Dan Casino.
Oh, thank you, Peter.
Sure. And that's the truth. And they'll find out why soon enough.
And Peter, of course, is my favorite administrator, but that's a very low bar. All right, regardless. So Peter, let's start us off the way we normally would. So right now, if I'm looking at the poll numbers, and of course I am, because I'm constantly updating my Twitter feed and doom scrolling. If I'm looking at the polling numbers right now, it looks very much like Joe Biden is going to run away with this at a walk. Is just to run away with this election. And honestly, I think the fact that Democrats were, worried by 2016, they think we can't trust the polls. And so that's why they're thinking, well, this is really competitive. Maybe Trump will win. If any other election, if this had been an election before 2016, I saw a candidate up by 10 points in the national polls, I'd say it's over. So Peter, is it over?
Well, let me put some bumpers on that, because you're right. It cuts both ways, right? There are Democrats who are nervous that there's going to be hidden Trump votes. And now there are Republicans who are coming out saying there is a hidden Trump vote, so you can't believe those polls. In fact, many of you might have seen this headline somewhere today. A Republican pollster making the case that there's a big hidden Trump vote. And people have been claiming that for years. And I have to say emphatically, there is zero support for that. There is no hidden Trump vote. Now, for you supporters of Trump who might be disappointed by that, I have other news for you that you'll find more palatable. But for now, I have to say there's simply no evidence for this hidden Trump phenomenon. And I'm going to say something now about 2016, although I think we'll probably come back to that over and over again, Dan. You know, in 2016, the polls were spot on nationally, but it's important to recognize that this is, in a way, not really a national election, right? This is an election that takes place sort of on the same day, but it's really an election that takes place in 51 separate states, right? And so
I was about to say 51.
national poll can be misleading in that way, right? And in 2016, what I think people overlooked, and they're still overlooking, is the undecided vote. In 2016, Trump was perceived as a challenger, and it was not surprising in that sense that the undecided vote in places that were very close, like Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, broke almost 2-1 for the challenger. In this race, he is not the challenger. So it's completely different. Now, the map I have up here, Dan, that's from this morning. That's Real Clear Politics. And the reason I like this map is because in contrast to that 10-point lead we keep talking about nationally for Joe Biden, what we see here is the number of states that are in play. So I'm sure people can understand, right, that the reddish states are being projected already for a Republican win. The bluish states are being projected already for a Democratic win. But you see how many gray states there are, right? That's a lot of states. And if you look up at the top, if you can see how many states are still in that toss-up column, right? 181 electoral votes on this map are considered toss-up states, right? So even if Biden has a pretty consistent lead, let's say in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, in Florida, that lead is very narrow, and it's in contrast to the national vote. I saw a poll of California today, Dan, and the poll showed something like 65% for Biden and 30% for Trump. Well, think about how that plays into a national poll, right? So in a way, states like New Jersey, New York, California are exaggerating that popular vote a little bit, and it's hiding the very close contests in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, et cetera. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to show one more slide, Dan, because I love this slide. This is from 2016, and what it shows in the left-hand column, where I've sort of put this chicken scratch, is despite the fact that it shows, Hillary Clinton with a narrow lead over Donald Trump, just 2 percentage points. All of these polls have a considerable percentage of undecided. The Bloomberg poll, you can see, has 9% undecided. Well, that's pretty substantial. The Economist poll had 7% undecided. Now, the rule of thumb is that at least a third of those will not show up, but the rest of them will. And it's a question of whether they'll break evenly or they'll break for one candidate or another. In 2016, they broke for the challenger.
And Peter, I'd say the other thing to notice in that is how well those third-party challengers are doing in those polls. Now, you and I both know, because we run polls in this, that most of those people who say they're voting for third party are either lying or they're not going to vote at all. And I think that was a big source of some of that error or perceived error we saw in 2016, was that there were all these people saying, oh, I'm going to vote for Gary Johnson, or I'm going to, and those votes are very hard to predict. And those candidates are doing very well. This cycle, they're not doing very well. We're only seeing 1 or 2% for the Libertarian and the Green Party candidates. And that does reduce the error a lot. And I think you're right. The undecideds are much, much smaller, partially because people don't hate both the candidates. That was the problem in 2016, is we had a lot of voters who disliked both candidates quite a bit.
Yeah, they did. That is true. Here's another slide to support that. And this shows just Trump approvals over 4 years. And what you can see is that despite what appears to be a lot of movement in these squiggly lines, the range is fairly small, right? It's between, for Trump approval, it really is only a range of from 38% approval to 46. So that's really a narrow band, and it's held steady there for a long time. It's hard to imagine a candidate with approvals that low, that is to say, that steady, suddenly changing dramatically. That's probably the biggest worry sign, I think, for the Trump campaign, that these approval numbers are just not budging for him.
Right. And if we looked at 2012, for instance, Obama was running with approvals in the low to mid 40s when he ran for re-election. But those numbers had been way up earlier, right? So there were, and what that showed us was, even though if only 45% of the public was approving Obama at that time, there was another 15-20% of the public that was open to approving of him. And the ceiling on Trump's approval does seem to be a little below 50%. No matter what he does, half the country's not going to like him.
Right, exactly. That's exactly right. So let me ask you, Dan, the pollsters say they've measured everything they can measure here, and they've got all the important elements under control. What do you think? I mean, do you think they're missing anything?
So this is a really interesting question, right? Because in 2016, it turns out we figured out exactly what we were missing, right? In 2016, the big problem the pollsters had, as Peter pointed out, it wasn't a problem with the national vote, but in state level elections, what pollsters really were missing was the effect of education. That is, we'd assumed, based on previous elections, all the elections as far back as we were doing polling, is that essentially white people without a college education voted about the same as white people with a college education. The education didn't matter a lot. And the reason that counts, the reason we care about that, is because if they're voting about the same, we don't worry about the fact that we were missing a lot of people with low education in our polls. So it's harder to get people with less education on the phone. They have less trust, they have less social capital, they don't pick up their phone as much. And so because we thought that people who don't have much education and people who do have a lot of education vote about the same based on other characteristics like sex and party identification, we didn't worry about it. And it turned out in 2016, that mattered a lot. It didn't matter in 2012 and 2008. It's not like it always mattered, we just didn't know about it. Education didn't matter in those previous elections, but in 2016, it mattered a lot. And because of that, we wound up underestimating the votes of less educated white people. And that's what switched those state level results in states like Wisconsin and Michigan. So the question we have to ask is, what are we missing now? Because if we're missing something, it could cause that same sort of cascade of errors. And so when Peter shows you that map of the Electoral College, it's tempting to look and go, okay, well, honestly, Peter, I'd push back an RCP there. I don't think that Pennsylvania is really much of a toss-up. Pennsylvania, he's been polling 9-10 points ahead. But even if you take Pennsylvania out of toss-ups, that's not 270 Electoral College votes for Biden. And so you think, okay, but there's 7 other states in there. So he's going to win 1 or 2 of those, which is enough to put over the top, so he's probably got it. The problem with that is that our uncertainty here is correlated uncertainty. That is, if we're wrong about North Carolina, we're probably wrong about Florida too. And if we're wrong about Florida, probably wrong about Arizona and Ohio and all these other states at the same time. If we're missing something, we're missing it everywhere. So it's really important that we know what we're missing and we have some idea of what characteristics really matter. So what characteristics could we be missing this time? We deal with education, we deal with race. we deal with age, we look at sex, we look at all these things, trying to figure out what really matters.
Right.
For me, what's really striking about 2020 is that President Trump is doing worse than 2016 among almost all groups. The only groups he's doing better at with 2020 than 2016 are actually men from non-white groups. Non-white men are supporting President Trump more in 2020 than they were in 2016. And that's interesting because we've come to think of the African-American vote and the Hispanic vote, the Hispanic or Latino vote, as being very solidly Democratic, more among African Americans than among Latinos. And of course, ranging widely based on which ancestry we're talking about for Latino and Hispanic ancestry. But we consider that them to be in the Democratic column. And this year, we're just not seeing that. We're actually seeing a much larger gender gap, a gap between men and women among Hispanics and Blacks than we are among white people. And it's a huge gap. And the fact that President Trump is doing well among Black men and Hispanic men tells me that something is going on here with masculinity, with gender. We normally have assumed that race matters more than gender, that race and partisanship are the most important characteristics in determining how someone's going to vote. But I would argue that actually gender, masculinity, is becoming more important. In some cases, it seems becoming more important than race. And that really offers a way forward for President Trump, that if people are voting on the basis more of being man and masculinity and their gender and what they perceive men are supposed to do than the basis of their race, it could cost Democrats a lot of points among Hispanics and African Americans. And that itself could potentially flip a race in a tight state like Texas or Florida or Arizona. And we're seeing the effects of this in Nevada, which should be a state that Democrats should win handily based on demographics. But we're seeing a lot of movement among Hispanics in that state, and especially Hispanic men, towards President Trump. So the problem with this is that we can't just say, okay, it's men, because it's not all men, right? It's men who have these very particular gender identities that really work with masculinity, that feel that being a man is really important to them. And that cuts across. In 2016, we talked about this among white men. But in 2020, we're seeing this not just among white men, but also among men of all races. And that means the margins that we expect among people of non-white ancestry might not be there for Joe Biden the way they were there in 2016 for Hillary Clinton.
So I have to ask you, Dan, so how do you measure this masculinity dimension?
Right. How do we measure gender? So gender is really a tricky thing to measure. And the reason it's tricky is that we're really bad at doing it. In most polls, and we've been guilty of this ourselves, Peter, we have a variable called gender, and that variable called gender is actually sex. It's male or female. And the way we measure it is by asking the interviewer on the telephone, say, hey, does that sound like a man or a woman? That's all we do. And if they say it's a man, it's a one, woman, it's a two, we call it a day.
Truth is, it saves a lot of money, Dan.
It does, but also we're assuming, making a lot of assumptions there about how good the interviewers are figuring this out. And also we're missing out. So that's measuring sex, but it's not measuring gender. It's not measuring how important someone's masculinity or femininity is to them. It's not measuring how masculine or feminine they are. And that winds up being a bigger divide in politics than race, winds up being almost a bigger divide as party identification. So Trump's biggest supporters are men across races who say that they are extremely masculine. They say they have no hint of femininity in their identities, and they think that's very important to them.
How do you ask that question exactly? How do you get at this?
Well, the gold standard way is the BEM sexual inventory, right? It's about 50 questions long, and you can do it over the phone in probably less than 20 minutes. So it wouldn't cost you more than about $30,000 to put it on a sample.
Right.
So we've been actually working, something the Public Mind poll, the FDU poll has been doing over the past year or two, is exploring new ways to measure this question, trying to boil it down to just one question and see if we can get some results today, is asking people, hey, we know that gender identity is a fraught concept. What makes someone masculine or feminine changes over time. So how about you? Like, do you place yourself, do you think you're extremely masculine, somewhat masculine, feminine, somewhat feminine, extremely feminine, and ask them to put themselves on the scale? We've had very good success with that so far. We've got a couple papers published about this. And we're hoping that this actually not only allows us to weight our data better, but also encourages other people to do this. So we've recently gotten the same item on big surveys, like the American National Election Survey is going to be asking that question this year. So we've got some movement towards that. And I think that's going to be increasingly important as we move forward. So I'm looking at gender, right? That's one of the things I do research on and I'm very interested in. So I'm really excited that, and it's one of those things where I almost wish the things that were really good for my data and my research were also good for the world, right? Because of course, people being very strictly tied to gender identities and trying to be very feminine, very masculine is not necessarily good for them psychologically or good for the world. So I wish I could find something good for my research, good for the world. So that's what I'm measuring. But what are you looking at? Like, what demographics are coming out to you right now that you think are important in this race?
Well, let me put a pin on that because I have a follow-up question for you about gender. What I noticed today, looking at some polling data, is that Trump is doing poorer in this 2020 year than he did in 2016 among white women, especially older white women. So what's your notion about why he's doing? It's not like they have new information about his attitude towards gender, right?
Well, here's the thing. We actually generally assume. So first off, I want to say I normally don't look at women's gender identities. I don't do a lot of research on that. For the same reason I don't do research on non-white people's gender identities. I don't understand it. It's not my gig. There's people who are, there's women who study gender identity. They're very smart and they know what they're doing. So I try to speak for them.
Okay.
What I can tell you though, is in the polling, in 2016, after the Access Hollywood tape came out, President Trump's numbers went down with everybody except with older white women.
Oh,
which is weird. Like, wait, why would anyone like that? Because when we look at gender identity, it turns out older white women actually, again, a subgroup of older white women, have more traditional gender identities than any other group, which makes sense. If you grew up in a very different society where gender roles were very different, you've held on to those gender roles. And so that group of women has very traditional gender roles. Now, it's not that they like Donald Trump, right? Because, he wasn't trying to appeal to women. Rather, they didn't like Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton, as an avowed feminist, was seen as attacking them, right? They saw Hillary Clinton as a threat. They saw Hillary Clinton as devaluing their experience as women with traditional gender identities. And so they didn't like Hillary Clinton. Joe Biden doesn't present that kind of threat. So we'd expect that Joe Biden would do better among that group than Hillary Clinton did.
Okay. All right. Well, that leads me into my question very neatly then, which is, or my answer to your question, which is, what am I looking at? And I like to look at favorables. That's kind of my thing. And I'm going to show a slide here with some favorables. If you just give me a moment here, I'm going to put up this slide here. So we're talking about 2016 and 2020. Here's a slide from 2016, which is just the last week of the election. Whoops. Let me try that again. There we go. Okay. So what we have there is a graph that shows that in the last week of the election, Clinton's favorables took a nosedive. She had a big advantage over Trump up until that last week. And so the poll numbers really didn't change that last week. That is to say, the straight out vote preference did not change. And so that was a little misleading. But underneath that, the next question we often ask people is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion? And we give them the name, right? And that's a little different from who are you going to vote for? It's while both answers may be emotional, it gives a different dimension to the candidate. In the last week of the 2016 election, Clinton lost much of her edge in the favorable ratings, and she lost it among undecided voters. Most of that decline is around the undecided voters. And not coincidentally, it was the weekend, 2 weekends before the election, that the FBI director Comey released his announcement that they were reinvestigating some more indifferent Clinton emails. And of course, he came out the next weekend and said, it's all copacetic, but the damage really had been done. And to the extent that Hillary Clinton attributes her loss to him, I think she actually has a pretty good case. And my recommendation would be to avid poll followers to look up this number, because it's not often reported. But it does give candidates, or it does give you a good indication of where people who are not committed might wind up. Right now, we have Trump's favorable or unfavorable. I'm sorry, let me throw that back out there, right? So you have a pretty steady line of both unfavorable and favorable for Donald Trump. It just doesn't move that much. He's generally between 40 and 45 favorable, and generally between 50 and 55 unfavorable, and not much movement.
So, Peter, I just want to jump in there in that graph real quick and point something out to folks, which is the way these favorable and unfavorable numbers work. So if you look at the mathematics behind them, right? So I've done research on this going back to the Eisenhower administration. I wasn't doing it during the Eisenhower administration. We were just looking at data from the Eisenhower administration. And what you find is that every president has basically a natural level of approval. And they're going to rise or fall that natural level. And approval works like a rubber band. The farther they get away from their natural level of approval, the faster it snaps back to that natural level.
Right.
We normally measure this by looking at media coverage, right? The more media coverage, positive or negative, the more it pushes up or pushes it down, and then it comes back down. Here's what's really cool about Donald Trump's presidency. And again, not so good for the world, but really good data for me, is that President Trump's natural level of approval is actually significantly higher than his actual approval numbers are.
Yeah.
He just never gets to his natural approval because what happens, because we have such a flood of information about President Trump, that his approval never gets the chance to go back to the natural level. And it's almost all negative information. And again, you can blame that on media bias, or you can blame it on the president's behavior, whatever you want to do. But the objective fact is there's this flood of negative information that's really unprecedented among modern presidents. I mean, I've looked at the data for George W. Bush and Obama and in Trump. We've never had anyone that has this much sustained negative media coverage. So President Trump, I would argue, if he actually were to shut up and go away and lock himself in a room for about 2 weeks and didn't say anything and disappeared from the media, his approval numbers would be about 5 points higher than they actually are, because he's constantly hurting himself by constantly opening his mouth and talking and saying things that make him unpopular and lead to negative coverage.
Well, rumor is he's fixing to get rid of Bill Stepien as his campaign director. So maybe you need to put your name in for the job, Dan. Right. So here's one more graph that shows this phenomenon, but in relation to Joe Biden. Right. So what we're showing here is the net difference in favorability between Trump and Biden. And what you see here is a pretty healthy margin that's actually larger than his poll lead. Right. So polls are showing him somewhere between 7 and 10 points ahead, right? These favorability ratings put Biden ahead by 15 in this sort of feel-good contest. Now, it's hard to imagine, I think, between now and then of something that's going to turn that around. Lots of people are pointing out, in fact, Karl Rove had a piece in the Wall Street Journal today pointing out that somehow Donald Trump with his numbers is exactly where he was 12 days before the election 4 years ago. But that overlooks a number of things. And one of them, of course, is the intervention of Comey. And of course, the other thing it overlooks is that 4 years ago, he was the challenger while Hillary Clinton was considered something of the incumbent, the continuation of an Obama presidency. Now that's been reversed. So it's really Biden who has the role of challenger, and this challenger has a pretty good margin in his favorable ratings.
Right, and I gotta say, I think Karl Rove, I don't think he always gets things right, but I think he's definitely right on this, that President Trump, in theory, could turn around. If President Trump went into tonight's debate and behaved completely differently than they did in the first debate, and really talked differently and looked more like what people expect from a conventional president, I think his numbers would go up. His approval numbers would go up. Sure, but
you think it would make a decisive difference in this?
I think it would make some difference, right? President Trump could increase his numbers if he behaved differently. The problem President Trump is facing, and the problem President Trump's advisors have been facing throughout, is that President Trump is to this point unwilling to behave differently. As far as he's concerned, behaving the way he has, gotten to be president. So why, if it's made you successful, why in the world would you change now?
Right. Okay. Well, he does have a lot of control over his own campaign. There is a constant complaint, even from Jared, that people are reluctant to tell him what he doesn't agree with. And Jared has been trying to tell him that he's lagging in the polls, that his first debate performance was not good. And apparently now people have been telling him that, and we'll see how he changes his behavior. It makes me wonder, though, about some of the things that he says and reiterates. And one of them is this reluctance to dismiss conspiracy theories, right? And I saw this poll just the other day, Dan, from Morning Consult, which I read every morning. And they do a lot of interesting stuff, as I'm sure you know. And this is about QAnon. And to what extent do people think that there is some legitimacy, some truth to QAnon? And of course, the pattern they're presenting is very clear, right? That 40% of Republicans think that some of the QAnon conspiracy stuff is either somewhat accurate or very accurate. So let me ask you, I mean, is this something that works for Trump, or is this something that hinders him, or does it make no difference?
Well, as we just said, right, President Trump, as far as he's concerned, what he's been doing for 70 years or so has worked for him so far. He's not going to change. And even in recent years, right, embracing conspiracy theories has very much helped President Trump. He came to basically public notice as a political figure, as someone who was embracing the birtherism theory, which was nonsense, but the false belief that President Obama was not born in Hawaii, but was actually born in Kenya and then somehow smuggled to Hawaii. So this is nonsense belief, but President Trump was willing to talk about it, claimed to have information on it that he never revealed, and said he had evidence that President Obama was not born in Kenya. And then, of course, during the 2016 election, gave up on that and said, oh, never mind, I never really believed this. I know it's not true. Kind of half-heartedly, but said it. And so embracing conspiracy theories has been something President Trump has been doing and has been successful for him. And when President Trump does this, he has a pretty scripted approach, which is, I don't know much about this, but I'm putting it out there, right? And we'll let everyone decide. So this is what happens when he was asked, for instance, about white supremacists supporting him. He says, well, I don't know them, but we'll just put this out here. Or recently he retweeted a conspiracy theory saying that Navy SEALs did not actually kill Osama bin Laden, but something, and Joe Biden committed a crime. He said, well, I'm just putting it out there.
Right. So you're not taking ownership of that.
Well, and President Trump also has been showing to some extent a great deal of loyalty to his supporters. That is, if he believes someone is a supporter of his, he's not going to throw them under the bus. He's not going to say anything bad about people who are his supporters. And that's to some extent an admirable trait. And so this has come up when he's been talking about white supremacists, but also about believers in the QAnon conspiracy theory. So we should talk quickly about what QAnon is. I would, look, if our audience here doesn't know what it is, they're probably happier for it, but we can talk about it anyway. So QAnon is started as someone who was claiming to be inside the government, who had secret information about conspiracies within the government. And gradually this, whoever it was, and actually we're pretty sure it was this guy in New Jersey, was just spun out these theories to the extent that they involved the Bilderbergers, Satanists, at least one pizza parlor in Washington, D.C., and a global cabal of democratic cannibalistic pedophiles who commit satanic rituals. That includes Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, the Clinton Foundation, George Soros, and anyone else you might want to think of as a boogeyman. And so this is the theory, if you've ever looked into it, is objectively insane, right? The idea is that, again, Hillary Clinton, George Soros are kidnapping children to abuse them and then eat them. And doing this with a series of way stations in the United States. And
are you saying you don't believe that, Dan?
I have not seen any strong evidence for this. Okay. And although this is not impressive in American history, this is actually very similar to satanic panic we had in the 1980s, where people believed that daycare centers were sites of satanic activity that led to, in that case, in the 1980s, dozens of people going to jail for satanic activities that never actually happened. Some of them are still in jail for that. Regardless, why are people saying that they have heard of QAnon, they believe it? So I would argue a lot of what we're seeing here is what we call a proxy statement. That is, Republicans, especially Republicans with high levels of knowledge, right, who know more about politics, have heard the president say, oh, I don't know much about them, but they're against pedophilia, so I like them. And know that this is something Democrats are attacking the president on. And so if I'm a good Republican, I know, boy, Democrats saying they're against this, I guess I must be for it. So I want to look like I'm smart. If you ask me, have you heard of this? People say, yeah, I've absolutely heard of it. Of course I have, yes. And do you believe it? Sure. And you can say it without really knowing anything because you know there's no follow-up questions. I would propose that if we were to ask this question differently, if we were to say, tell me one of the major tenets of the QAnon conspiracy theory, the number that could do it, even among Republicans, would be somewhere around 1 in 10, right? And it would be concentrated among people with higher levels of information. So I don't believe that this is true in terms of QAnon, but I believe this is true in terms of proxy statements, right? People willing to say things because they think it's a way of showing I'm a good Republican or I'm a good Democrat because I believe this, right? Regardless of whether it's true or not. And we've actually can study this by asking about things that objectively are not true or things that are made up. I've seen good research on this, asking people whether they approve of the police actions, the shooting of a made up person. And we get a very similar partisan divide where Democrats say, of course the police are at fault. And Republicans say, no, the victim was at fault. And they say they know about it and they know who's at fault, despite the fact that it never actually happened. These are proxy statements, and we have to be very careful with how we interpret them. Right, Peter, remember, you and I a couple of years ago ran a question about the Second Amendment. And so we did the most extreme Second Amendment question we could think of, which is, do you think there's going to be a need for it? Do you think there's going to be an armed rebellion against the government in the next couple of years? Just like trying to push it as far as you could. And we did get about a third of Republicans said, yes, I think that. Do they really think that? Goodness, I hope not. But they're willing to say, because they know that's a symbol, that's a signifier that they are in fact a good Republican. So Peter, I know we're going to have to move over to questions and answers in a minute. Before we do, let's assume that the polls are right, because we're pollsters. We want the polls to be right. And President Trump's defeated. What do you think happens next? Right? We're in unprecedented territory here. You know more history than I do. So what do you think happens next?
Well, you know what I'm going to say, Dan, that the most important thing that's going to happen is that President Trump or Donald Trump is not going to go away. I know a lot of Democrats as well as a lot of Republicans. And one difference between them these days is Democrats are holding their breath and they think they're going to release their breath the day after Election Day. They think that if only Donald Trump is swept from the Oval Office, that everything will come right again. So I'm here to say, Dan, I don't think that's true. I don't think that, I think that Donald Trump will vacate the White House, but I do not think that Trump or Trumpism are going away. I like to remember and remind people that there are tens and tens of millions of people who have embraced Donald Trump. They are united by a number of views. Those views are not going to be erased. Their energy is not going to be erased. And Donald Trump certainly isn't going to be erased. If we know anything about Donald Trump from his past life, we know that he comes back, right? We know, and I should say the obvious, which is, remember, Donald Trump will be eligible to run again in 2024. I'm not predicting he will, but he is eligible, and that will be something that will keep the cameras focused on him for the next 4 years. I expect him to be a vocal and frequent critic of the president if it's not him.
And look, we have historical precedent for this, right? I mean, if we look at, I think the closest historical precedent we have to Donald Trump is Andrew Jackson, right? Someone who came in, basically took over a political party that didn't necessarily agree with them and reshaped it in his own image. And after Jackson left office, right, Democratic presidential nominees for the next several years, next 6 or 8 years until he died, would make pilgrimages down to Andrew Jackson and seek out what he said and pay attention to every word he uttered. And he was still largely responsible for shaping the party and, what was his own party. And I think you're absolutely right, Peter. And I think it's easy to overlook what the appeal of President Trump was in 2016, which is that he was talking about globalization. He was talking about the modernization of the economy that has left a lot of Americans behind. Mm-hmm. And there is a need for a political party to address that. Donald Trump was doing that. And that need has not gone away. And the idea we go back to more politics that's more as usual doesn't really change any of this, right? That demand is still there.
Got it.
So Peter, I do have a question from the audience for you. So, Peter, so why is positioning candidates as challenger versus incumbent, even at the end of a two-term presidency, why are you looking at that? Because you kept on talking about, oh, Biden's the challenger now versus Trump is the challenger in 2016. Why does that matter? Why do we care about this?
Because I'm really interested in those undecided voters, and that's not something that people who report polls spend enough time talking about. So if you go back again to 2016 and you look at whether it's state polls or national polls, in most of those polls, they're reporting some range of undecided voters. Well, on election day, they're not going to be undecided. So you have to do something with these undecided voters. And if you're lucky as a pollster, a third of them will stay home, a third of them will break for one candidate, a third of them will break for another candidate. But we also know from lots of experience that, especially in tough times, they're more likely to break for the challenger than for the incumbent. So that's why I'm focused on that number, because I'm focused on these very close states where even if Biden is winning or Trump is projected as the winner, the margins might be very small. And there might be 5, 8, 10% in any given poll who are undecided. I want everybody, next time you look at a new poll, to check out the undecided column. And I want to ask Dan Cassino while we're at it, but when election day comes up, what do you think that's going to look like? I mean, obviously, it's already very different from any previous election day because as we speak, so many millions of people have voted, right? So what does this look like on election day logistically?
So logistically, what we see is there's the big gap is between states that are counting votes early and states that are not counting votes early. So some states like Pennsylvania that are not counting their votes early, which means they're going to be just massively overloaded with votes. I don't expect to find out who's going to win Pennsylvania for 10 days at the best after the election. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be a while. However, that doesn't mean that we're going to have a long national fortnight, election, not fortnight instead of election night, because it's still, I think you're going to see one of two things happening on election night. And so I'll be on election night, I'll be doing my coverage on Pix 11. You can tune in there if you want to see me be confused and try and explain it in real time. But what you're going to see is either we're going to see, I think if it's a Biden blowout, we're going to know relatively early in the night, 10, 11 o'clock, you're going to know when Florida and Arizona come in. Those are both states that have live vote by mail, but they also start counting those votes early. Meaning Florida and Arizona, when we see those votes come in, if both Florida and Arizona go for Biden, it's over. There's no way, there's no concealable path for victory for President Trump that doesn't include Florida and Arizona. That also tells us that the polls were basically correct or even underestimating the Biden vote. If that's what's happening, then President Trump is lost. If that doesn't happen, if Trump wins both those states or one of those states, we're in for a long night and a long week. I mean, I was working in a newsroom during the 2000 election. I remember trying to put that newspaper to bed at 3 a.m. and still not knowing who the winner was. And we went a long time without that. And the concern I always have is one about democracy. And that is, we want elections to be driven by the voters. But we found out in 2000, if we didn't already know it, is that elections, like polls, have a margin of error. And if the vote was in that margin of error, if it's close enough, that I can conceivably say, well, but if you count this way, I win. If you count this way, they win. If you're close enough that you can do that, you're within the margin of error of the election. And at that point, votes stop mattering. At that point, it is down to elected officials. It is down to judges to decide who the winner of the election is going to be. And I sincerely hope we don't go down that route. That whoever wins does it decisively and does it quickly. Because, look, 2020 has been a heck of a year, but I don't think the worst is past us yet. If we don't, even if we have a clear winner on election night, I think it is going to be a very chaotic couple of months until inauguration day, no matter who the winner is. And hope for our sake as a country that it doesn't actually go the way we think it's kind of we may go.
So are you saying that in the 2000 election, we had one Florida and judges and politicians, but in the 2020 election, we could have any number of Floridas? Well,
it's a lot. Things are a lot more up in the air. And to make, in New Jersey, for instance, when we have a recount normally, a recount in New Jersey election is very easy because they have the little data set in Excel, and you want to recount, they go, okay, cool. They push the enter button again, and they recount all those cells, they add them up again. Nothing changes, right? Because all the electronic voting. When it is mail-in balloting, there's a paper record. Now, fair vote advocates will say that's a good thing. There's a paper record, you know who voted, but it means there's something else to count there. And that's going to be happening in almost every state. So you have the potential for a recount with paper balloting in almost every state. And that's a little bit terrifying. All right. So
I'm sorry, I wanted to follow up that, okay, so you give us a good picture of election night. But there are other elections going on, right? There's quite a number of Senate seats. And at this point, people are saying, well, maybe the Democrats will take the Senate as well. So here's a slide that shows the Senate, right? And right now we're saying it looks like there are 8 toss-ups in the Senate. What are you thinking about the Senate? What are you preparing to say on WPIX?
On election night, it's what we're really looking at is what turnout models look like. And that's the big unknown right now. Because so many places are shifting over to vote by mail, we expect there's going to be much higher turnout, that more people are going to vote than otherwise would vote. In general, we think of that as being good for Democrats. More people voting is generally good for Democrats. But at extreme levels, if you have so people who are rare voters, people who don't vote a lot, tend to be Democrats. But people who are very rare voters, people who almost never vote, tend to be Republicans. So if you just if you have enough extra voting to pick up the rare voters, it probably favors the Democrats, and you're probably going to get a Democratic Senate. If you have so much extra voting that you get on people who never vote and you bring them in, at that point things get a lot closer to a toss-up. This one says, I feel pretty confident based on the polling that Joe Biden's going to win the overall election. But in the Senate, this looks very much like a toss-up. And I think we could be looking at a situation where we are looking at a 50-50 Senate, and it's going to come down to whoever winds up being the vice president flipping the tie. Also, weirdly, we've got 2 Senate seats going up in Georgia. This is sort of thing that doesn't normally happen. And even the fact that we got 2 seats at once, and even one of them is something that's posting a toss-up in Georgia, tells you a lot about what's going on in this election. That if even Georgia and Texas are in play, my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Peter, we got a question. So how, obviously we're the experts, right? We have all the information we want, but our audience, no, we don't. Our audience might want to be getting more information. What is the best way for citizens to figure out how they should be voting and what the candidate stands are? Because let's face it, the debates, the last debate, the tonight's debate, they're not informative. It's people shouting at each other. Where should we actually be going to get information?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great question, but it's almost impossible to answer, right? Because
Peter, why do you think I gave you that question? Yeah, I know.
Because the universe of information is almost infinite, and that's the thing that makes it so hard to be a voter. I'm not one of those people who belittles the voter and talks about how little they know about the political system, or how little involved they are, or how little they know about the issues. Because the fact is that I'm a full-time political junkie. I get paid to be a political junkie as you do, Dan, and yet I can't possibly be well informed on every issue of the day. It's not possible, especially in a global world. It gets worse. I would challenge you, just to support this point of view, I would challenge you, watch your favorite cable news show, whether that's CNN or Fox or something else, and then turn on Al Jazeera, or the BBC if you prefer. But you will get a totally different agenda of news and information. I'm not talking about any bias. I'm just talking about the amount of information and the universe of possibilities of information. So where do you go and get information? I mean, we're surrounded by traps, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or any place else. I, of course, have my favorite sources, but I'd hate to impose that on everybody else. The only advice I would give is know who your publisher is, right? Anybody can make a web page, anybody can make a YouTube video. There are thousands of fake YouTube news programs of people peddling whatever weird ideas they have. And there are hundreds of thousands of weird websites peddling whatever peculiar views they have. So you're on your own. What do you say, Dan?
I would say stay off of Facebook, stay off of Twitter, right? Get news from social media is almost always going to be bad. It's going to be biased towards the things you want to see, but more importantly, it's going to be biased towards conflict. I mean, social media, they know how to make money. It's by getting more conflict. And so if you want to get calm, reasoned decision making, it makes sense to go to other news sources. I think it's also important to decide for yourself what issues are important to you, what your viewpoints on those issues should be, and then find candidates that match those issues. For the most part, when people are thinking about politics, they go the opposite direction. That
Right.
is, they decide which candidate they like and say, well, I like President Trump, so immigration is the most important issue. You have to decide for yourself beforehand. And that's very difficult to do. And in fact, a lot of cognitive psychologists would say it's impossible to do, to separate out your affect, your liking or disliking from your cognitive biases.
Right. And you bring out one of the strange flaws of the American system, as let's say, as compared to, let's say, a multi-party system in Israel or Europe, right? Where in the American system, your choices pretty much come down all the time to two people. And if you made a checklist of issues, you might find that, well, on one hand, these issues that you're interested in match up well with candidate A, and on the other hand, these other issues you think are important match up well with the other candidate. But you're always stuck with this dilemma of, and I think that's why people talk about choosing the lesser of two evils. That's really the way the system is set up.
Right. And, this is an election where you think, oh, well, people should be voting for a third party. But again, it's the structure of American politics, right? Structure of American government. We really don't get these third parties.
Right.
They're not going to be viable. And,
Right.
Until you change the Electoral College and change the way we vote, it's not going to happen.
Right. So here's a very meaty question for you, Dan.
Sure.
Maybe you want to take this into account. Some of the uncertainty that questioners is suggesting in the polls might come from the increase of early voting and voting by mail. So he wants to know, or she wants to know, how do pollsters take into account this early voting phenomenon in their likely vote model? And
Okay.
is it a help to the polls, or does it introduce new error in the polls?
Okay, so first off, we should say that early voting in general is really, really good for pollsters, right? Because if I'm building a likely voter model, and at this point in the election, if I'm running election poll, I ask, hey, did you already vote? And if they say yes, I go, great. Now I don't have to worry about my likely voter model. I know you already voted, right? No, there's a little bit of a problem there that oftentimes people who already have voted are less willing to tell us who they voted for. It's when they say, I'm going to vote for this person. But another thing to say, I did vote for this person. People are a little more reticent about that. So we have to push for a little more, but all right, we can get past that. So that's generally a good thing. Overall, early voting and vote by mail is a bad thing for pollsters. And the reason it's a bad thing for pollsters is it means we don't know who the junk is going to vote. We just don't know, right? We know in a normal election who votes and who doesn't. We're pretty good at figuring that out. The problem is this cycle, voting changed. And so if you ask why do people vote, the number one reason why people vote is because they're in the habit of voting. That's why people vote. We could talk about democracy. We could talk about all these high ideals. No, the major reason people vote is because they're used to voting. So we change up everything. And we're now voting by mail or voting 2 weeks before the election. That changes that. And as a result, a lot of people are going to vote that otherwise would not have voted.
Because they have that ballot right in their mailbox and they just tore it open and they're looking at it.
Right. And if it's New Jersey, they look at it and they look at it for 20 minutes trying to figure out how the junk they're actually supposed to vote and which thing am I not supposed to pull off and whatever. But the point is that we've gotten out of the normal habits, which means as a pollster, I don't actually have a good idea of what the outcome looks like, what the likely turnout model looks like. Now, we are seeing pollsters doing very good work, and I don't always have good stuff to say about Patrick Murray down at Monmouth, but Patrick Murray and Monmouth doing a good job of reporting multiple turnout scenarios, right? Yeah. And one thing we're seeing with these multiple
it's out three scenarios.
Yeah, and New York Times Siena is also working with different turnout models, and what we see generally is that those differences in the turnout models don't seem making a huge effect. Don't seem having a huge effect on the actual top line numbers. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to get through it. On one hand, I think vote by mail is good for democracy and good for America. So because more people voting. Right, and however you feel about political views, it is always good to have more people participating in the process. However, it does make my life harder. So I will reiterate once again, I would like, just for once, things that are good for my data to also be good for the world. And here's something that's good for the world and bad for my data. Boy, it just never works out for us, does it, Peter?
Someday your ship will come in, Dan. There's no doubt. Now we have Patricia, who teaches history at a high school.
I was going to send this over to you, Peter. So where
really?
should Patricia be focusing for election-based lessons?
I think that one of the things that people are not looking at, Patricia, and maybe they should, is just New Jersey. I'm not sure which grade you're teaching in high school, but there's so much focus on the presidential race that people overlook that there are these other things going on. 10th graders, okay. So let me suggest maybe you should share with them a congressional map of New Jersey. Here we go. I happen to have one handy. So, this is an important thing, right? So the New Jersey delegation has some challenges here. In this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but in these two light blue areas, right, there are recently elected Democrats who beat longtime incumbent Republicans 2 years ago in the 2018 midterm. And they have some pretty good challengers who are well-funded and well-informed and veteran campaigners. And so that'll be very interesting to see how those two come out. In one of those districts, Tom Kane Jr. is the Republican nominee, and that's really a flagship name in New Jersey. So we'll see how far that takes him. The more interesting race, perhaps, is down in South Jersey. You see the gray Cape May, right? So there is actually an FDU alum, Jeff Van Drew, who is trying to hold on to that seat. I'll say, for the benefit of all our alumni, Dan, they should know that right now, FDU has 2 alumni in the House of Representatives, which is just fabulous for a university in our category. So our other representative is from Delaware. Jeff Van Drew, though, down in South Jersey, he has held that seat for a few years, just 2 years, really. And he switched parties, which is a very unusual thing. He won that seat by a very narrow margin as a Democrat, and then decided that the writing was on the wall that Republicans were going to hold that district. And I think he made a very a pragmatic decision for himself to go to the Republican Party, where he felt the base was much stronger for him and for the party. But he drew a pretty well-funded and likable challenger who happens to have the last name of Kennedy. So right now, that race is a toss-up. And I think on election night, that's going to be a great district to look at for your high school students.
Yeah, and a lot of people are dunking on Jeff Van Drew, saying, how do you switch parties and switch to the minority party? What are you thinking? You still might lose anyway. I would posit it's probably a good idea for him to have switched, because if he hadn't switched, he would have lost in the Republican primary, and he wouldn't even gotten this far. I would also say, Patricia, one of my favorite resources is a radio show put out by New Hampshire Public Radio called Civics 101. I've been on it a bunch of times. They do very good work. Students get it as a podcast, and they actually have whole lesson plans built into their podcast feed, for different things about, here's 10 episodes of the presidential election. Here's 10 episodes about the Constitution. Here's about the founding documents. Here's about government matters in the life cycle. All those things, some of those would be very good for your students. And Peter, unfortunately, we still have more questions, but unfortunately, I think we are out of time. So I think we have to hang it up.
We should get a ruling from Jen on whether we can continue or not. I did have one more slide I wanted to show you, Dan, because I think you'd be interested to see this. There's this slide here. And this shows, if you look at the highlighted yellow columns, what that shows is just white voters in New Jersey. And you really see a different picture. So the overall poll numbers in New Jersey show a very comfortable margin for the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. But if you just look at white voters in New Jersey, you see a different story.
Yeah, and
White
this
voters
is,
in New Jersey favor Trump. You can see men here favor Trump by a very wide margin, 20 points.
Mhm.
Women, 41% of women expressed preference for Trump. That's just, and Trump won white women in New Jersey 4 years ago. So that is another indication of a little backslide he's had among female supporters.
absolutely. And this is not just New Jersey, this is nationwide, really, right? It is the gender gap, the sex gap is the biggest driving factor. It is an increasingly important driving factor in our politics.
And the race gap, no?
Race gap is to some extent declining in importance, right? Although there's more non-whites.
When I look at this poll, these poll numbers here, Dan, I think there are two different New Jerseys, right? You look at all the aggregated results, you see one conclusion, right? But if you just look at white folks in New Jersey, it's a different kind of state.
Absolutely.
Right?
It's more of a South Jersey state too. And we did have one other question I'll address in about 10 seconds, which is what to do about the election anxiety. And the answer is, if you know, please tell us, because we would like to find out as well.
Please tell, if you do know the answer to that, please share it in the chat for everyone. I think we're all anxious about the next 2 weeks. First off, I want to say thank you again. Thank you so much, Dr. Wooley and Professor Casino, for such an enlightening look at the upcoming election. I think based on a lot of the questions that started to come in and the conversation we were having, we probably could sit here and talk about this for several more hours. But we do have another event that's happening tonight at 8. And in case you needed it, we are going to include the Zoom link for our next homecoming event in the chat window. And that is The Power of a Story with author and alumna Nicole Melleby. So take a look in the chat window and you can see the Zoom link right in there. Even though we cannot meet in person, we want to remind everyone that we can stay engaged with the FDU Alumni Association through various virtual events that we are hosting, including 2 more days of homecoming at home activities. Also, be engaged and please consider making a gift to support student scholarships at FDU. So many lives have been impacted in 2020. The pandemic has created many financial challenges for our students, and they rely heavily on student scholarships to pursue their dreams. You can sign up for future webinars, see what's happening on campus, and support student scholarships by visiting us at support.fdu.edu. Thank you again for the presentation tonight, and thank you everyone for joining us and taking time out of your evening. Hopefully you can catch our next event. And if you're really into the elections, you can catch tonight's debate as well. Everyone have a great night, be safe, and stay healthy.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you
Jen.
both.
And thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Always fun, Peter. We need to have lunch soon, once we're safe. All right.
I'm looking forward to it.